Hello and welcome to the second part of this lesson on the creation of 3D external views within Rhino. In the first part of the lesson we looked at how to set up the view in Rhino and export it out into multiple render elements. These were the capture element, which was the basic screen capture from Rhino, kind of with each colour representing a different material in our scene. We have the reflection layer where we set up a basic material with a reflective index in the Rhino material editor, and then we added that onto our objects and rendered out that layer, and also the shadow layer, which is basically a black and white image showing the light and shadow in our scene. Now we're going to be using all these three passes in combination, and we're just going to be using Photoshop for this lesson. So we're going to start by creating a new file in Photoshop and loading these images into that file. Now to do that, we're not going to create a new setup in Photoshop. We're going to use a script called load files into stack. So that's just found in File, Scripts, and what this does is it allows us to load these images in simultaneously into a new Photoshop file. So if I just hit browse there, and we can select these three images, hit OK. So we've got all three of them there, and we're just going to hit OK to load them in simultaneously. So there we have each image overlaid on top of each other, and because we made sure we kept the resolution of each image the same, they perfectly line up on top of one another if we just go through the layers there, and they've kind of stacked up in a stack. So we're going to start by just kind of creating a new folder for these incoming layers, and we're going to call these render elements. It's really important to use folders in Photoshop just by using this little icon down here to help keep your layers tidy as we go forward, because we're going to be adding a lot of layers into our Photoshop file. Now we're going to make this a colour as well. If you right click on a folder, you can add a colour to the folder, so we can easily locate that later, and you'll see that the layers within that folder have also been given a colour too. Now the first thing I want to do before I start working on my image is set up a basic colour scheme I'm going to be using. Now to do this I usually use a combination of kind of imagery that I'm using as reference imagery for the project, and then maybe also site photography to get the colours correct in the scene. For this image I've got some site photography of the Robin Hood Gardens here, which I'm just going to drag and drop into my Photoshop file. And then I've also got this old vintage travel poster as well, and a lot of time I use these with images that are based in the UK, because you can kind of get a selection of colours from different areas, and they're really kind of quite nice colour selections in these posters. Obviously this one is nowhere near the particular project I'm looking at, but I quite like the colours used in the image, so I'm going to be using that as a reference as well. So I usually just drag these in to my Photoshop file and have these just on another layer as a kind of reference. And we're just going to take those and we're going to put those in a folder as well called reference. Give it a colour too. It's good to get in the habit of kind of foldering and colouring different things so you can keep them well organised. And these are going to become our kind of base references for our colour scheme. So in here I usually then make a new layer and just draw out a square box and start to pick up some of the key colours from these photos. So it might be that I kind of want this green sky. So I just take it and then drop it into the box. And we're just going to go ahead and sort of pick a selection of colours. I usually take a couple for vegetation and greenery. And we're just going to start to build up a basic colour scheme using this technique of just kind of colour dropping from the images, building it up. Then for kind of building colours I might take a couple of these colours from the photo. I also quite like these oranges from this image here. And it's good to get quite a good range of colours and tones as well. And you can use this basically as a starting point to help set up your colours in the scene. So I'm just going to pause the video and continue getting a few selection of colours, and then we're going to go through them, which ones we've used. So I've finished getting a basic colour palette now, so what we've done is I'm going to hide these. So I've just saved that on its own layer. I'm I'm going to just pop it in the corner there, and we've got a colour for the sky, a series of colours for the kind of greenery and vegetation, a series of colours for the building, and then a series of colour for the water. So that's a kind of mixture of palette, and I'm going to be using these moving forward to help apply colours onto my image. Now we've got those saved in a folder, but I'm actually going to take this capture layer and we're going to hold down the Alt key and drag this up to the very top of my Photoshop file. What that does is it makes a copy of that layer and copies it onto the top. And we're going to be using this, we're going to be turning it on and off, and we're going to be using it to help us select our key materials in our scene. So for example, I'm going to take the magic wand tool, and if we wanted to select the greenery here, we can just make sure that this contiguous box is ticked off, and we're just going to click on an area of greenery and then hold down the shift key and select these other areas. You can always up the tolerance a bit as well to help you select kind of more of that colour. There we go. And the aim is to kind of select the majority of the green space, like so. And if you've got a few extra bits here, you can see my door's green too, so it's kind of picked up that. I then just take the marquee tool, hold the Alt key, and just deselect those elements. We're kind of just looking to select just the green space. And once that's selected, we'll then make a new folder, call this ground. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply a mask to this folder. So with this area selected and the folder selected here, we can click on this option here, which applies what's called a layer mask to the folder. If I click that, you'll see that we've now got this black and white image, which is masking the contents of that folder. So if I then decided to create a new layer in that ground folder, and I took my paintbrush and I started painting in that layer, make sure we're on 100%, and we've got our capture turned off, you'll see that it's only applying to the ground area I selected. And that's what's really useful about using masks, is you can kind of key off key parts of the image. So I'm just going to delete that for now. And what we're actually going to do is make a new layer. And instead of painting, we're just going to pick one of these kind of colours I've got for my landscape, so probably this green here, and we're going to just fill that layer with that green. So there we have the first of our materials broken down into its own layer. Now I'm going to use the same method by using the magic wand tool, selecting this time the windows. That's actually got pretty much all of them on the first try, so we're going to make a new folder, call it Windows, apply the mask to the windows, take a colour from our colour scheme. I'm going to choose this kind of light blue here, make a new layer and colour the windows in. And we're just going to go around, and I'm going to pause the video now and just do that to all the elements of my scene. So we've got the walls, the floors, this internal wall here, the pond, and just start to build up a base series of colours on my image. So I'm going to pause and just go forward and do that. So there, all we've done now is made a folder for each material in the building and added a colour from our colour scheme to each of those folders. And you start to see now it's already starting to take on a form of kind of more of an image than a screen capture from Rhino. It might be that if you zoom in, some of your edges are a bit untidy on these masks. So what you can do is, if we go to the floors layer, if you press the / key on your keyboard, it's the one to the left of the Z key, you can isolate the mask, and it has a kind of red colour where everything's being masked and it's not red where it isn't. And then you can use the rubber tool with that mask selected. I'm going to make this a bit smaller to help either rub out or kind of rub in that mask. And you see that if you just start to rub, you can rub it out. And then if you press the X key to flip the white and black around, press it once, you can then use it to rub out instead of rub in. And you can, all I'm doing is I'm kind of holding down the left click on my mouse key And if you click in one spot, hold the shift key and click in another spot, it draws a straight line between the two of the rubber. So I'm just doing that on the edges of this, just to tidy up the edge. This one's okay, this might need a little bit of tidying up. And what I usually do is just kind of go around, and any small discrepancies like this I'll rub out. You can get a bigger rubber. You can also use the square brackets key on your keyboard to make the rubber bigger or smaller. So you can make it bigger to rub out these pieces. And I'd usually just go around looking at my masks I've made on my layers and just tidying them up a little bit, like so. It all depends on kind of how big you're going to print your image and how tidy you want it, but it's a good kind of thing to do, to go around and tidy these up to make it neat. As with anything, the more kind of work you put in at this stage, the better your image is going to turn out to be, so it's good to kind of make sure that all of these are nice and tidy moving forward. So that's a kind of quick way you can go around and tidy up your masks, and I definitely recommend sort of going around and making sure everything is clean and up to date. But that's the base of our image now. So we've got all our folders with our different materials in, and each one has a colour based on our colour scheme. So once we've set all those up, I'll usually select all those folders and put them in a new folder called Material Adjustments. And we'll give that a unique colour as well. So we have our reference, material adjustments, and our render elements there. Now the next folder we're going to make is a shadow layer called Shadows. I'll actually keep my reference layer kind of above anything else. We'll make this, give this a blue, actually we've already got blue, haven't we? Let's make it a yellow there. So in our shadow layer, we're going to take the shadow render element we originally rendered. We're going to hold down the Alt key again and we drag that into our shadow folder. Now you see it's now kind of overlaid on top, but it's blocking all the colours we've made, and we don't want that. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the blending mode of this image to blend into our colours that are below it. And to do that, where it says normal here, we can set it to multiply. And now what multiply does is it makes anything black show up black on the image and anything white disappear. So you'll see it's really good for shadows because it overlays the shadow and the darkness on top of our image, like so. Anything in this section brightens it up, so it does the opposite. So anything that's white gets brighter in the image, and the overlay and soft light are kind of a combination of the two. So it might be for something like this actually a soft light is something more you want to go for. But for now we're going to use the multiply. And we're just going to reduce that down so it's not as heavy on the image. So all that's doing is it's overlaying that shadow and just softening it a bit. So we're getting that tone in on the image. Now something I quite like to do, which works quite well with these as well, is to colour the shadow before you overlay it. So if I went back to normal and put that back up to 100%, we can add an adjustment layer, which I've found down here. And I always add adjustment layers rather than going to image adjustments, and the reason for that is that we can then go back and edit it later. So it's really important you always add in adjustment layers instead of adjusting the image up in the top left here. So we're going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer. Make sure my shadows are in that folder as well. Give them the right colour. And we're going to attach this adjustment layer just to this shadows layer. Now, if I just had it by itself and I turn that off, any adjustments I make in my hue saturation, so if I change the saturation, it will change the whole image if I change the hue. So we don't actually want that to happen. We just want it to affect the layer below it. And to do that, if we hold down the Alt key between these two layers, you'll see there's a little arrow comes up and it allows us to clip this adjustment layer to the layer that sits directly below, like so. Now what happens is if I change any values on my hue saturation will only affect that layer. Now what we're going to do is we're going to click colorize, because we're going to give the shadows a colour, and I'm going to make them a kind of dark blue here. Like so. Now if I go and add this on a multiply, you see it's now got a kind of blue tint to the shadows, and I found this sometimes works quite well. It's a bit nicer than just having a black shadow on your image. And then you can, if you found that's too blue, you can go and change the value in that adjustment layer on top of it. Might be that you want them a different colour. You could change them to a red or purple, but we'll stick with the blue for now. I'm quite happy with that. So that's very simple, just taking that shadow layer and overlaying it on top, and you can see already just by using that shadow layer we're starting to get a lot of extra detail into our image, and that's really what we're kind of using it for, is to pick up on those bits of detail coming in. What you could also do is we could use the reflection layer and also overlay that too, because that's got kind of base light and dark and tone in it. Because I've only rendered half of it and we didn't kind of wait for it to render, you want to make sure that you're not rendering or overlaying these extra lines on if we did that. But we could do it in much the same way, putting it on a multiply layer and knocking it down a bit to get a bit more tone. I think for this we're not going to use that at this time though, so I'm going to keep that down there. But that moves us on nicely to the reflection of the building. So if I wanted to start to add that back in, all I have to do is we're going to close up the shadow file. Because I've already made kind of spaces for my water and for my windows, we're going to start by just dropping this reflection layer into the water folder. So I'm just going to hold down the Alt key again and drag that up into water. And you see already I've literally just dropped that in and it's already starting to look quite effective, just overlaid in there. Just going to mask off the top to make sure that that's not overlaying on top. And instead of multiply, we're going to try a couple of different blending modes. Soft light sometimes works well with reflections, hard light, kind of depending on what you want to go for there. It might be as well that you want to get a bit of that kind of orangey colour into that reflection too, and sometimes I play around with the kind of the fill on that too. It also might be like my image here isn't quite accurate, and it seems to be that the reflection kind of got cut off on the side there. It's looking a bit weird. I think it's mirroring part of the landscape that's kind of stopping. So to paint that in, you could just use the paintbrush tool. You might just kind of make a layer on top of the reflection layer, colour pick the colour below, and you can just paint that in on top. Sometimes it won't kind of perfectly merge because it's being overlaid on top, so if that happens, what you might want to do is put this back to a normal, put it up to 100%, colour pick that colour, and just paint actually on top of that image. So we're just, oh, it's because we've got our shadows layer turned on. Make sure you turn that off because it's overlaying on top. And then we're just going to paint in that extra bit of shadow there, and then just use the rubber tool to tidy up that edge. Just use a white brush actually. So we're just going in and editing that photo just to make it look a bit better. There we go. Then we can put that back on a soft light and knock it down a bit. There we go. So we're starting to get that reflection in the water. It might also be that you could want to add a bit of colour to that building. So we could make a layer on top. We can take some of that orange colour, and if I just overlay it on a colour blending mode and then minimise it a bit, knock it down, we can start to kind of pull in a bit more of that colour. into the image. So it's kind of up to you how you play around with that, but it's sort of all using these methods of taking the colours, overlaying them, and we're just sort of overlaying each element on top of one another. Then I'm going to do the same for the windows. Just take that reflection layer and drop it into my windows. This one's a little bit more subtle. You can see here some of the windows are kind of reflecting an area that others aren't. And I'm just going to have this quite low down, just so we've got a bit of kind of difference in that. You can kind of see the before and after there. So very quickly we're starting to build up our image and kind of add in extra tones, shadows, and light and dark. So what we're going to be doing is in the next image, we're going to, in the next lesson, sorry, we're going to start to add in a bit more animation, some people, trees, environments, and really start to kind of build this image up. But this is the base setup for any external image you're doing. Now I know we're going with a particularly kind of colourful style on this image, so what I'm also going to do is in a couple of lessons we're going to show you how to do a completely different style, a kind of black and white, more tonal image using exactly the same methods. So this method we're looking at doesn't just apply to a colourful style image like this, you can use it for any different style of image you're trying to produce. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next session.